American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. During the period intervening between the Declaration of Independence and adoption of Constitution in 1787, the government of United States was strictly speaking not a government in real sense of term. Only independent states had come together to ward off the common dangers. The government of this period is popularly known as Old Confederation. For the Articles of Confederation, noble in intent, were deeply defective in design. This is the story of their defects. Defects that nearly unraveled the revolution itself. The Articles of Confederation made no president, no prime minister, no central executive of any kind. Power was vested solely in a one-chamber Congress. At first, this seemed a safeguard against tyranny. Americans had fought too long against the crown to create another throne. But the absence of an executive left the nation leaderless. No single figure could enforce laws, oversee administration, or give direction in times of crisis. Foreign powers struggled to negotiate with a faceless Congress, and domestic policy lacked coordination. In the heat of war, General Washington himself often complained that Congress lacked the energy and efficiency of a true government. And after the war, as debts mounted and trade faltered, the nation's inability to act swiftly revealed a glaring weakness. Without an executive, the United States was like a ship without a captain. Adrift, with no one to hold the wheel. The Articles also provided no national judiciary. Disputes between citizens of different states, or conflicts between states themselves, had no impartial court to resolve them. Imagine a dispute over boundaries, or a question of contracts between merchants across state lines. Each state interpreted law through its own courts, its own biases, and its own interests. There was no supreme authority to unify or settle these disagreements. The result was confusion, injustice, and lingering hostility. States occasionally ignored Congress's recommendations, choosing instead to protect their own sovereignty. Without a judiciary, the law had no final arbiter. The Union was fragile not just in politics, but in justice itself. Even the Congress itself, the only organ of national authority, was poorly organized under the Articles. It was unicameral. A single chamber. With each state, large or small, holding exactly one vote. Virginia, with its vast population, wielded no more influence than tiny Delaware. Attendance was irregular. Delegates often returned home for long stretches, leaving Congress without the quorum needed to act. Important decisions required approval from 9 of 13 states. A nearly impossible threshold when states were divided by geography, interest, and ideology. Worse still, amendments to the Articles demanded unanimous consent. One state alone could block necessary reforms. This rigidity paralyzed Congress, making adaptation to new challenges nearly impossible. In theory, Congress was the embodiment of national unity. In practice, it was often a chamber of empty seats, deadlock, and impotence. Perhaps the gravest defect of the Articles was Congress's lack of financial power. It could not levy taxes. It could only request money from the states. Requests often ignored or only partially met. During the Revolution, this meant soldiers went unpaid, supplies ran short, and inflation soared. The infamous continental currency became nearly worthless. After the war, debts to foreign allies and domestic creditors piled high, yet Congress lacked the means to pay. State legislatures, jealously guarding their own treasuries, resisted federal pleas. Some states contributed, others refused. The result was chaos, inequality, and a national credit in ruins. Without power to raise revenue, the national government was dependent, powerless, and perpetually in crisis. Equally damaging was Congress's inability to regulate trade and commerce. Each state pursued its own economic policy, imposing tariffs on neighbors and competing for advantage. New York taxed goods from New Jersey and Connecticut. Virginia and Maryland squabbled over navigation of the Potomac River. To foreign powers, the United States appeared divided and weak. Britain exploited these divisions, restricting American trade with its empire while the states failed to respond collectively. Congress had no authority to establish uniform tariffs or negotiate trade agreements binding on all. The result was economic warfare among the states themselves, undermining the very unity the revolution had sought to achieve. The promise of one nation gave way to the reality of 13 competing economies. Perhaps the most fatal defect was Congress's inability to enforce its own laws. It could pass resolutions, but it had no power to compel obedience. States could, and often did, ignore national directives with impunity. In matters of finance, military supply, or diplomacy, Congress depended entirely on state cooperation. If a state refused, there was no mechanism to punish or compel compliance. The Articles created not a government, but a series of recommendations. This lack of enforceability bred disunity and defiance. It weakened America's standing abroad and threatened its cohesion at home. A government whose laws could be disregarded at will was scarcely a government at all. These defects were not abstract. They had real consequences. Soldiers who had fought for liberty returned home to unpaid wages and worthless currency. Farmers burdened by debt rose in rebellion, as in Shays' Rebellion of 1786. Merchants suffered under conflicting state tariffs. Diplomats abroad were humiliated by their inability to secure respect for treaties. Foreign nations doubted the endurance of the American experiment. Britain refused to evacuate its forts in the Northwest, confident the powerless Congress could do little. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, certain that the United States could not resist. The Articles, designed to protect liberty, had created a government too weak to defend it. By the mid-1780s, it was clear, reform was essential. Leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison called for a stronger national government. Their voices were joined by merchants, farmers, and veterans who had suffered under the Articles' failures. The Annapolis Convention of 1786 was the first step. Its delegates urged a broader meeting to revise the Articles. That call led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where the defects of the Confederation gave birth to a new framework, the United States Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were America's first attempt at self-government. Bold, experimental, and noble in purpose. Yet their defects nearly destroyed the Union they sought to preserve. Without an executive, without a judiciary, without financial power, without the ability to regulate commerce or enforce laws, the Confederation was a government in name but not in strength. From its failures came lessons. From its weakness came resolve. And from its collapse came the Constitution, a stronger framework designed to secure both liberty and order. The Articles of Confederation remind us that freedom without structure is fragile, and that the birth of a nation is as much about learning from mistakes as it is about celebrating victories. Our Articles of Confederation ought to be revised, and measures immediately taken to invigorate the Continental Union. Depend upon it, there lies the danger for America. This last stroke is wanting, and unless the states be strongly bound to each other, we have to fear from British and, indeed, from European politics. Marquis de Lafayette.